The Atlantic Ocean stretched endlessly, a dark expanse where danger could appear in a single shadow. Convoys of merchant ships creaked and groaned, their decks crowded with sailors, cargo, and tension. Every horizon was a threat. Somewhere beneath the waves, German U-boats waited silently, their periscopes slicing through the water like black knives. Torpedoes could strike at any moment, and the only protection lay in vigilance, discipline, and luck. On one such merchant vessel, the crew moved with routine efficiency, though fear was never far. The engine room roared below deck, the boilers coughing steam and fire into the night, while on the deck, sailors stared at the horizon with binoculars and squinted through haze, watching for the telltale swirl of a periscope. They were tired, hungry, and wary, trained to respond yet human enough to tremble when a shadow fell across the waves. Among them, a cook carried a different kind of burden. His hands were used to stirring pots and chopping vegetables, not to strategy or gunnery. Yet he watched. He watched the shapes of ships, the way light fell across the hull, the angles that made one vessel appear larger or smaller through a periscope's narrow lens. He saw patterns that officers overlooked, mistakes that could become fatal. And then, one day, he spoke an idea aloud, a simple, almost foolish suggestion. Why not make the ships harder to read? At first, the officers laughed. A cook proposing naval strategy was absurd. Yet the seed of the idea lingered. He did not mean invisibility, not in the magical sense. He meant deception, confuse the enemy, turn a ship into a puzzle that could not be solved by periscope chart or quick calculation, make a moving target seem unpredictable. The idea was as audacious as it was necessary. Within weeks, experiments began. Patterns were painted across the hulls of merchant vessels, geometric shapes, sharp zigzags, and contrasting stripes that transformed the outlines of bows, sterns, and funnels. Ships that had once been predictable forms moving along a set course now appeared to wobble, twist, or shrink and grow, depending on the angle of view. What had started as a Cook's observation became the foundation of a strategy later known as Dazzle Camouflage. On the deck at night, sailors painted in silence, their hands trembling with fear and excitement. Each line, each stripe was a gamble. A miscalculation could reveal the ship's true silhouette to a U-boat captain or attract the wrong kind of attention. Lanterns flickered across the hull, casting moving shadows on decks crowded with anxious men. They worked quickly, sometimes sneaking past officers who doubted the plan, sometimes shouting instructions across the wind-whipped deck. The purpose was not subtlety, it was misdirection. Through the periscope, a ship could appear longer, shorter, or moving in the wrong direction. Torpedoes, which relied on estimating course and speed, were now more likely to miss. In the vast chessboard of the Atlantic, even a few seconds' confusion could save lives, preserve cargo, and keep the supply lines open. Sailors who survived encounters with U-boats remembered those first painted ships with awe. A freighter would slide past, zigzagging in impossible patterns, while the enemy's calculations failed repeatedly. Lives were spared by lines of paint, by angles and contrasts, by a strategy that seemed more art than science. The cook's simple idea had become a tool of survival, a small rebellion against the inevitability of enemy sight. Yet the work did not stop at paint. Officers and sailors began to study optics, angles of light and shadow. Artists and engineers collaborated on hull designs, testing patterns in miniature models, and observing the distortions they created. The deckhands learned the language of deception, how a diagonal stripe could bend the eye, how contrasting patches could hide the bow or stern, how chaos could be used as armor. Each ship became a moving canvas, an experiment in survival. The human mind, the cook realized, was the enemy's weak point. U-boat captains were skilled, trained, and experienced, yet they could only perceive so much at a distance. Dazzle worked because it exploited perception, turning what seemed like a solid, predictable target into a confusing, moving shape. The ocean, which had once been a uniform battlefield, became a theater of illusion. On quiet nights, sailors would gather and whisper stories of ships that had escaped with only scratches or bruises, of torpedoes that splashed harmlessly into waves because a captain misjudged the target. These were not tales of heroism in the traditional sense. They were stories of ingenuity, of survival, and of small victories in the face of relentless danger. The cook, once laughed at, became a quiet legend. His idea had saved lives in ways that guns and armor alone could not. But as the war progressed, the threat evolved. Visual deception alone could not defeat the next generation of hunters. Sonar, hydrophones, and active detection systems emerged, listening to the ocean rather than looking at it. Submarines could no longer rely solely on the errors of human sight. The lessons of Dazzle would need to evolve, but the principle remained. The senses of the enemy could be manipulated, deceived, or disrupted. Innovation, even when it came from the most unlikely source, could change the course of conflict. Despite these looming challenges, the immediate effect of the cook's idea was undeniable. Convoys survived where before they would have been easy targets. Sailors slept a little easier, knowing that a few seconds of misdirection could mean the difference between life and death. The decks of merchant vessels, once chaotic and tense, now carried a quiet pride. Every brushstroke, every pattern was a statement. We are not helpless. We are seen, but we will not be understood. The cook never claimed genius. He did not write manuals or create diagrams. His contribution was observation, courage, and a willingness to speak an idea that others dismissed. Yet the impact rippled far beyond his ship. The Dazzle pattern spread through fleets, adapted for different hull shapes, weather conditions, and operational theaters. Artists and sailors learned to improvise. Engineers learned to quantify visual deception. The war at sea was changed by a single insight. Perception could be weaponized. At night, when storms rolled across the Atlantic and waves lashed against the hulls of painted freighters, sailors could glimpse the fruits of their labor. A distant U-boat periscope might rise and fall, searching for a target, while the ship itself slipped past, unreadable, almost ghostly. The ocean swallowed the ship's path and returned it with distortion. It was a survival born from necessity, a triumph of creativity against technology, chaos against order. And yet the story had just begun. The principles that guided Dazzle Camouflage would soon inform experiments in sound, shaping the efforts to make submarines effectively invisible to sonar. The seeds planted by a cook and a crate of paint would evolve into materials and methods that could bend sound waves, absorb echoes, and hide a submarine beneath the ocean itself. The war at sea had entered a new phase, one where ingenuity, observation, and daring ideas became as important as steel and gunpowder. For the sailors aboard those early dazzle-painted ships, each day remained dangerous, each crossing a gamble. But in the art of deception they found a new form of armor. Their minds were engaged, their spirits strengthened. Survival was no longer only a matter of speed or firepower, it was a matter of perception, creativity, and trust in the unpredictable ingenuity of ordinary men. The Atlantic remained a theater of shadows, but the cook's insane idea had illuminated a path through darkness. It had shown that even in war, when death waits in the waves, the human mind could find a way to bend reality, to trick the enemy, and to survive. Convoys moved on, painted and alive, carrying food, hope, and the echoes of a single, brilliant insight. One man, one idea, one brushstroke, enough to change the face of naval warfare and leave a legacy that would shape the oceans for decades to come. The morning fog rolled in from the Atlantic like a ghostly curtain, thick and relentless. Merchant ships creaked and groaned beneath their cargo, their painted hulls glinting in the pale sunlight. From the perspective of a periscope, the scene was chaos incarnate. Stripes, zigzags, contrasting panels of black, white, grey, and sometimes shocking bursts of colour. Shapes that should have been familiar, bows, sterns, funnels, now twisted and warped, as if the ocean itself were playing tricks on the eyes. The Allied navies had adopted Dazzle camouflage not for beauty, but for survival, and the results were immediate, visceral, and sometimes miraculous. For the men aboard these vessels, Dazzle was both art and armour. Sailors painted through cold rain and stifling heat, their brushes guided by the instinct of survival rather than aesthetic sense. The patterns were deliberately confusing, designed to throw off enemy targeting calculations. Torpedo attacks depended on estimating a ship's speed, course, and heading. Dazzle did not hide the ship, it forced the enemy to misread it. A bow could appear as a stern, a prow could seem to veer off course. The ship's trajectory became unpredictable, and in war, unpredictability could mean life. On the bridge of a freighter, a young officer squinted through a pair of binoculars, measuring the angle of his own ship in the fog. His hands shook, not from cold, but from a mix of adrenaline and awe. "It's working," he muttered. "They can't tell where we're going." Down on deck, painters wiped sweat and rain from their faces, smearing colours and patterns across steel like artists possessed by urgency. Every line was a gamble, every panel a weapon. The science behind the illusion was deceptively simple. The human eye, especially when constrained to a periscope lens, seeks patterns and symmetry. Dazzle disrupted both, replacing the familiar with the abstract. Diagonal stripes, jagged edges, irregular polygons, each element forced the observer to recalculate, to pause, to hesitate. In those precious seconds, a torpedo might miss, a ship might live. It was a game of visual deception played on an unforgiving stage, the stakes measured in human lives and tons of vital supplies. Convoys quickly became laboratories of this new warfare. Ships were repainted in bold, bizarre patterns according to trial and error. Some designs worked better at long range, others closer in. Officers measured angles, tested outcomes, and noted U-boat reports. Success was rarely absolute. Misjudgments were frequent, patterns sometimes counterproductive, yet the cumulative effect was undeniable. Enemy targeting accuracy declined, and survival rates improved. The sailors who painted and maintained these patterns were aware of the irony. A ship meant to be visible, to carry food, fuel, and munitions, had become a puzzle, a living enigma moving through a sea of death. Some laughed at the absurdity, others shook their heads, but all understood that these chaotic patterns were a lifeline. Dazzle demanded cooperation between artists, engineers, and crews. Everyone had to participate, from the lowliest deckhand to the captain himself. Survival depended not only on the stripes on the hull, but on vigilance, coordination, and trust. Enemy submarines, observing these ships through periscopes, faced new frustration. Experienced commanders reported confusion, miscalculations, and missed opportunities. One periscope sighting might suggest a ship was moving at 10 knots to port, when in reality it was 7 knots on a zigzag course. Another might make a freighter appear to be heading directly away when it was approaching. These errors, subtle yet deadly, reduced the lethality of U-boat attacks. Dazzle did not make the ships invincible, but it bought time, seconds, minutes, hours, that could mean the difference between life and death for crews and cargo alike. Yet the implementation of Dazzle camouflage was far from uniform. Some ships, repainted hastily or without guidance, became spectacles of visual confusion to both friend and foe. Allied convoys occasionally found themselves squinting at vessels whose designs were so aggressive they seemed to stagger under their own patterns. Officers learned quickly that Dazzle demanded balance, enough disruption to deceive the enemy, but not so much that it hindered coordination within the convoy. Communication, signaling, and visual identification had to survive alongside camouflage. As the war progressed, techniques evolved. Naval architects and artists collaborated, developing blueprints, diagrams, and scaled models to predict how a design would appear from periscope height. They experimented with angles, widths of stripes, and color contrasts, adjusting patterns to optimize misdirection. Observers noted that even small adjustments, shifting a stripe slightly, reversing a pattern, could dramatically alter how a ship's speed and direction were perceived. The interplay of art and science became a central component of Allied naval strategy. Some stories from the convoys were almost surreal. Sailors recalled entire wolf packs of U-boats hesitating, retreating, or missing targets because the painted ships appeared to swerve unpredictably through the fog. In other cases, a single freighter painted in bold geometric chaos slipped past multiple enemy attacks while unpainted vessels around it were sunk. The impact of Dazzle was not always measurable with statistics. It was felt in the rising morale of crews and the moments of hesitation it forced upon their enemies. Even at night, Dazzle served a purpose. Moonlight and starlight played over the irregular shapes, breaking the recognizable outline of the hull. The enemy's eyes struggled with the shifting contrasts between shadow and reflection. A darkened funnel might appear as the bow, a jagged stripe as a wake, and a freighter's movement through the waves became a living optical illusion. Observation and experience could overcome these tricks, but only slowly, and in war, slow often meant dead. Despite its effectiveness, Dazzle was not infallible. Aircraft spotting and radar soon limited its advantage. Torpedo fire from experienced U-boat commanders could still find its mark. Yet even in these circumstances, Dazzle offered something critical, a psychological edge. Enemy commanders could not be certain, and uncertainty forced them to be cautious. Hesitation and error, multiplied across convoys, saved lives in ways that guns, armor, or speed alone could not. The human factor remained central. Crews were trained to maintain the patterns, touch up stripes, and ensure the deception remained effective. The work was exhausting, tedious, and sometimes dangerous, as ships were still vulnerable to attack. Yet each stroke of paint carried meaning: defiance against an unseen enemy, protection for a comrade, a chance to survive another day. Dazzle was a shared commitment, a covenant between men and the vessel they defended. As months passed, the lessons of Dazzle informed other innovations. Scientists and engineers studied how the visual trickery could be adapted to new technologies, like early radar and sonar. They began to explore materials, coatings, and structural modifications that could mislead machines as well as human observers. In this way, the Cook A.S. initial insight that observation could be manipulated set the stage for the next generation of naval stealth, submarines, and warships designed to evade not just the eye, but also sound and detection instruments. The story of Dazzle is also a story of ingenuity under pressure. A simple, almost whimsical idea from an unlikely source, an ordinary cook, could inspire a chain of innovation that altered the survival chances of thousands. It illustrates a truth about war: necessity can be found in the humblest corners, and genius can emerge in the mess halls, the engine rooms, and the decks of battered ships. Creativity, courage, and audacity became weapons as vital as guns or torpedoes. By the end of the campaign, Dazzle had proven itself more than a novelty. It was a weapon of perception, a way to fight the enemy not only with steel and gunpowder, but with confusion, illusion, and misdirection. Convoys that survived despite overwhelming odds carried testimony to the effectiveness of visual deception. Artists, sailors, and the cooks who had dared to speak their ideas had together created a living form of defense, one that demonstrated the power of human ingenuity in a world dominated by destruction. And so, across the fogged seas of the Atlantic, through storm and mist and the constant threat of torpedo, painted ships moved like ghosts. Their hulls were canvases of survival, each line and angle a silent declaration that the mind could triumph over the eye, that life could endure against seemingly impossible odds. Dazzle did not make the ships invisible, but it made them unknowable, and in the vast, dark theatre of war, that was enough to save them. The Atlantic was no longer just a battlefield of eyes. By the early 1940s, machines began to listen where men once watched. The U-boats were patient hunters, but the Allies were learning to fight back not only with paint and pattern, but with sound itself. Sonar, then called ASTIC, could locate a submarine beneath the waves by sending pulses of sound and measuring their echoes. The oceans were alive with sound, the creak of steel hulls, the hiss of turbines, the groan of waves against ships. Every vibration could betray a vessel, every echo could be fatal. It was in this environment of noise and danger that the idea of acoustic invisibility emerged. Engineers, scientists, and even sailors obsessed over the question, could the enemy hear, and could they be fooled? The first attempts were crude, rubber coatings, canvas layers, and wooden slats affixed to hulls to absorb or scatter sound. Yet even the simplest experiments hinted at possibility. If light could be warped to confuse the eye, perhaps sound could be bent, swallowed, or misdirected to confuse the listening ear. At a naval dockyard, a group of engineers experimented with rubberized panels on submarine hulls. They hammered, sanded, and attached each segment, measuring echoes in tanks and testing them in open water. A small crew of sailors monitored the pulses of sonar, noting changes in echo strength and quality. Each successful reduction in return signal was a victory, a fleeting taste of invisibility in a war defined by detection. Submarine captains began to notice differences in the field. Silent approaches that once risked detection were now less likely to trigger sonar pings. Officers whispered about strange successes, about torpedoes missed or depth charges delayed. These experiments were dangerous, experimental, and sometimes deadly, but they represented a new front in naval warfare. One fought not in the open, but in shadow and sound. The stakes were immense. A submarine detected too early could be destroyed, its crew lost in the icy depths. Survival depended on a combination of training, intuition, and the physical modifications that had begun to wrap the hulls in acoustic armor. Each innovation was tested under pressure, often in full-scale exercises with destroyers and aircraft simulating attacks. The war demanded proof, and failure often came at the highest price. At sea, the men could feel the difference. Silent engines hummed beneath reinforced hulls. Sonar pings bounced back weaker. The enemy seemed to struggle to pinpoint the vessel's location. It was eerie, almost magical. Submariners described a sensation of slipping through the ocean unnoticed, like shadows sliding beneath light. The psychological effect was as profound as the physical advantage. Confidence grew, and with it, the audacity to take risks that could yield strategic victories. The transition from Dazzle to sound stealth was more than technical, it was philosophical. Commanders began to understand that deception was no longer limited to vision. Survival depended on manipulating every sense the enemy relied upon. If light could be bent, sound could be absorbed. If perception could be warped, timing could be thrown off. The lessons learned on painted decks now informed underwater engineering, material science, and the development of techniques that would define submarine warfare for decades. Every success inspired further innovation. Engineers experimented with air-filled mats, sound-absorbing tiles, and complex layering of materials designed to disrupt sonar pulses. Submarines were coated with rubber, composites, and early polymers. Even minor reductions in echo strength could delay detection long enough to allow a vessel to reposition, evade, or strike. These innovations required coordination between the shipbuilders, scientists, and the crews who would operate the vessels under the relentless scrutiny of enemy sonar. But the shadow war beneath the waves was merciless. Every experiment carried risk. Crews endured months of testing in confined spaces with the knowledge that a single miscalculation could mean detection and destruction. Yet they persevered. They understood that invisibility, even partial, could tip the scales in a conflict defined by detection, accuracy, and timing. At night, in the quiet depths, submarines became ghosts. The enemy sonar operators listened, trying to locate the hidden vessels, while those same vessels slipped through waves like shadows. Captains relied on intuition honed in patrols and training exercises, making split-second decisions based on imperfect information. The combination of human skill and acoustic innovation created a new kind of naval warfare, one in which perception could be manipulated as deftly as firepower could be wielded. The impact was profound. Convoys once hunted relentlessly began to report strange patterns. Submarines avoided detection, attacks were delayed, and some ships disappeared from sonar grids altogether. The war was changing subtly but irrevocably. Engineers continued to refine coatings, materials, and hull designs, working tirelessly to enhance the effect. Each victory was small, incremental, but cumulatively they saved lives and cargo, just as Dazzle had done above the waves. Innovation spread quickly. Knowledge of effective coatings, hull treatments, and acoustic masking techniques moved across fleets. Captains who experimented successfully shared techniques with their peers. Workshops turned into laboratories, dry docks became arenas of experimentation, and the war at sea expanded to include the invisible theatre of sound. Every successful test, every missed detection, reinforced the principle that ingenuity could alter the balance, even against a technologically sophisticated enemy. By 1943, submariners and naval engineers were pushing boundaries even further. Experiments with bubble screens, sound-absorbing paints, and structural modifications became increasingly sophisticated. Each innovation relied on the same principle that had guided Dazzle camouflage. Perception could be manipulated, senses could be tricked, and a clever application of materials and physics could confer a life-saving advantage. The psychological dimension was significant. Crews knew they were taking risks, but each success reinforced morale. They had learned to trust the technology, trust their training, and trust each other. Acoustic stealth became not only a physical tool, but a symbol of human ingenuity in a theater where the ocean itself could be lethal. Survival depended on both mind and machine, on courage, and on the willingness to embrace untested ideas in the face of extreme danger. Across oceans and battlefields, the lessons resonated. The same principle, using perception against the enemy, would evolve into modern stealth techniques, influencing naval design for generations. But in the midst of war, it remained raw, immediate, and visceral. Submariners felt the tension of potential detection in every sonar ping, every engine hum, every whispered order on deck. The ocean was a living adversary, alive with sound, shadow, and chance. The cook who had inspired Dazzle could scarcely have imagined this evolution. From paint and pattern to polymers and acoustic coatings, the philosophy endured. Trick the senses, survive, and turn ingenuity into armor. It was a war fought not only with steel and torpedoes, but with creativity, observation, and relentless experimentation. By the end of the conflict, the innovations born from desperation and imagination had redefined naval warfare. Submarines could approach closer, escape faster, and strike with greater confidence. Crews had learned to move through shadow and sound as effectively as through fog and night. The theatre of war had expanded beneath the waves, and the same principles that had saved painted freighters now protected entire fleets. The race to hide from sonar was a testament to human ingenuity in the darkest circumstances. It demonstrated that even in a world of machines, ingenuity could prevail. Shadows and sound became weapons as effective as guns and torpedoes. Survival was no longer solely a matter of courage, it was a matter of perception, physics, and the relentless pursuit of ideas that seemed, at first, impossible. In the quiet moments beneath the waves, submariners could feel it, the hum of engines barely detectable, the echo of sonar pulses weakened by rubber and polymer, the knowledge that they were slipping through danger unseen. It was eerie, beautiful, and terrifying. A vessel could move like a ghost, unseen, unheard, and yet fully present, a testament to the power of human innovation in war. The journey from paint to sound, from dazzle to acoustic stealth, was a story of adaptation, courage, and relentless curiosity. Each new development built upon the last, creating layers of protection, deception, and survival. Human ingenuity became as vital as any weapon, a lifeline in a theatre dominated by death. By the time the Allies had mastered these techniques, the ocean had changed. Ships moved with an almost spectral presence, blending art, science, and human skill. Enemy submarines struggled to locate them, torpedoes missed, and crews survived attacks that would have been fatal just a few years earlier. The war at sea had entered a new dimension, one fought in silence and shadow, where the mind became as important as the machine. Innovation, born from necessity, had become survival. And the simple principle that had begun with Dazzle, the idea that perception could be manipulated, had evolved into a profound advantage in the invisible theatre of the ocean. The ocean never forgets. Waves roll over sunken hulls and painted freighters, over submarines that slipped unseen through the depths, over cargo that was delivered against impossible odds. The Atlantic, the Pacific, the Mediterranean, they all became graveyards, theatres, and laboratories at once. And yet, in this chaos, human ingenuity left an indelible mark. From the absurd genius of a single cook to the engineering feats that made steel swallow sound, the war at sea had transformed into something new. A battle not just of guns and torpedoes, but of perception, deception, and survival. The legacy of Dazzle and acoustic stealth was profound. The painted freighters, once strange and colourful targets, became symbols of ingenuity and resilience. Crew members remembered the thrill of survival, the near-miraculous escapes from torpedo salvos, and the knowledge that clever thinking could save lives. These ships had become ghostly presences in the eyes of the enemy, visible, yet unknowable, alive, yet elusive. Their stripes, zigzags, and jagged patterns told stories of courage in the simplest and most visual form. Submarines, the hunters that had once terrified the oceans, learned that invisibility was no longer a myth. Rubber coatings, sound-absorbing tiles, and careful hull design reduced echoes, frustrated sonar operators, and allowed vessels to move with a spectral presence beneath the waves. Captains and crews navigated silent corridors, trusting the ingenuity of engineers and the effectiveness of technology that was born from desperation. In a theatre defined by the unseen and the unheard, skill and innovation became as lethal as torpedoes. The war also taught a profound lesson about the unexpected sources of innovation. A cook, dismissed by officers, sparked a revolution in survival thinking. Ordinary sailors, painters, and engineers all contributed to a body of knowledge that no single mind could have produced alone. Observation, courage, and creativity proved as critical as rank, training, or doctrine. In the crucible of war, the margins of hierarchy became a source of strength, and the human mind became a weapon as formidable as any cannon. These lessons echoed long after the last torpedo was fired. Post-war navies studied the principles of deception, visual trickery, and acoustic stealth, incorporating them into new ship designs and submarine technology. Radar-absorbing materials, stealth coatings, and complex hull geometries can trace their conceptual lineage back to painted freighters and rubber-coated submarines. Modern stealth technology, from aircraft to warships, owes a debt to these experiments, to the willingness of humans to challenge convention and defy expectations in the most extreme circumstances. Yet there was also a moral dimension to the story. Every painted freighter and sound-dampened submarine carried human lives, hopes, and fears. They were not mere objects, they were vessels of survival. The ingenuity that made them elusive also bore witness to the human cost of war, the tension of constant danger, the exhaustion of sailors who painted and tested, and the ever-present knowledge that failure could mean death. Innovation was both tool and burden, saving lives while reminding everyone aboard how fragile those lives were. The lessons of Dazzle and acoustic stealth extend beyond technology. They illustrate the enduring value of observation, imagination, and daring. They demonstrate that even in rigid, hierarchical institutions, insight can come from the most unlikely places. They prove that human creativity, when combined with necessity, can bend the rules of reality, even in the harshest, most unforgiving theaters of war. The cook's insane idea, born from watching, thinking, and daring, became a spark that lit decades of naval innovation. Stories of these ghost ships continued to circulate among sailors for generations. Veterans recalled the nights when painted freighters slipped past wolf packs, when submarines moved unseen beneath sonar, and when ingenuity saved men and cargo alike. These stories became parables of resilience, of courage, and of the quiet power of human thought in a world dominated by machines, steel, and destruction. They reminded crews that survival often depended on perception, creativity, and a willingness to embrace the unexpected. The Atlantic, Pacific, and Mediterranean remain silent witnesses. Beneath waves, sunken vessels rest with their secrets intact. Above waves, modern navies employ materials, geometries, and coatings informed by those early innovations. The ghosts of dazzle-painted freighters and sound-masked submarines live on in the lessons taught to generations of sailors. See the unseen, deceive the watcher, and always, always trust ingenuity. And so the story closes not with a battle won or lost, but with a legacy secured. One man's idea, the observation of a cook on a merchant ship, cascaded into a philosophy of survival that transcended paint, steel, and sonar. It reshaped the oceans, challenged conventional thinking, and saved lives through cleverness, courage, and human determination. In the chaos of war, small sparks of insight can illuminate the path to survival, creating ripples that endure far beyond the battles themselves. The oceans remember those ghost ships, their stripes, their shapes, their silenced echoes. They speak of innovation born from necessity, of lives preserved through ingenuity, and of the enduring truth that in war, as in life, perception can be as powerful as reality. Until next time, stay safe and see you in the next history video.